Welcome to another in the series of Perth, U.S. Asia Center Foreign Policy Conversations. My name is Gordon Flake, and I'm delighted today to be joined by someone who needs no introduction here in Australia, James Carouso, currently Managing Director of the BowerGroupAsia, based in Singapore, but known to our friends here in Australia as the highly effective and long-serving Deputy Chief of Mission, and then for a long time acting ambassador, Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Canberra. For the interregnum, for the last year or so before moving to Singapore, James served in Hawaii as the diplomatic advisor or the policy advisor to the Indo-Pacific Command. We're going to talk a little bit more about that too. But as someone who had a chance to interact with James regularly when he was at the embassy in Canberra and since, it's really been a great desire of mine to have a conversation like this with someone who covers kind of the breadth of issues. Because prior to coming to Canberra, Jim had a broad career in Southeast Asia. He had served as chargé at the U.S. Mission to ASEAN. He came to diplomacy relatively late after a 14-year career in finance and banking, and I think it probably showed in his approach to a lot of the policy issues that we face, but also time in Indonesia and Thailand prior to that. So it brings a wealth of experience in the area that we consider our near neighbor in Southeast Asia. And given his current role, we thought it'd be interesting to kind of both reflect back and then look at current developments in the region and look forward a little bit. So Jim, thank you so much for taking time to join me for this conversation today.
Great to see you, Gordon.
Now you're sitting in Singapore, which we in Perth like to refer to as our northernmost suburb. But the truth is, given the relative size of the populations, we're probably more accurately described as Singapore's most southernmost suburb. How's life in Singapore today?
Well, you know, I arrived just before the first shutdown, so it was a little odd entry into society here, into the business world here. But it's remarkable how they've recovered. You know, it's pretty much open now. We have to wear masks whenever we go out. They have a very aggressive tracing system. They're handing out tokens now, so whenever you go into any public place, it traces who you're nearby via Bluetooth, and it's all collected. So they take it very seriously, but as a result, there have been an average of less than 2 community cases a week for the past few weeks.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we first have to get over the hurdle of opening up to the rest of Australia, but then soon thereafter, our hope is that we can once again, resume those almost hourly direct flights to Singapore and entice you down here to our fair shores once again. So.
Oh, I'm ready. I'm figuring you may open up to Singapore before you open up to the rest of Australia.
Maybe based on your record, but mercifully we're doing well now. Let's take just a step back. You had both a challenge and a tremendous opportunity to head up the U.S. Embassy during a time of tremendous change. After the last presidential election, and as we speak, that was almost exactly 4 years ago today, there was a marked shift in, if nothing else, the tenor and tone of the conversation coming out of Washington, D.C. about alliances. And yet, it seems that the U.S.-Australia alliance has weathered the last 4 years far better than, say, NATO or even next-door neighbors like Canada, South Korea, or Japan, et cetera. I wonder if you might just take a moment to reflect on your time here and the U.S.-Australia alliance over the last 4 years.
Sure. Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that however erratic President Trump is in terms of alliances and the negative things he said about it, the alliance itself between the U.S. and Australia was never itself a subject of criticism. Why? Well, first of all, Australia spends its fair share on defense, and it's increasing. It buys a lot of kit from the U.S., and you have a trade deficit with the U.S. So those are all, in President Trump's book, A1 aspects of any good alliance. So you have all that. But beyond that, you have incredible ties, personally, military to military, bureaucracy to bureaucracy, and even people to people. And as we saw when the U.S. Senate passed a resolution in support of the alliance, when President Trump started making noises, it goes right through our society and our government until you get to the president who, as I mentioned, because the alliance meets those other ticks, that he puts in place, it's still strong.
You know, you will recall that the attention paid to the U.S. election 4 years ago was arguably, in terms of minutes on TV and radio and newspaper, greater than the attention that was being paid to an Australian federal election that was taking place at the same period of time or during the same period of time. And you won't be surprised to know that in the year plus since your departure here, that attention has not waned at all. Every day, the newspapers here are very much focused on the U.S. elections. We're taping this prior to the elections, 1 week prior, so we don't know the exact outcome yet. And yet, if you look at the Australian newspapers just in the last week, you had Greg Sheridan in the Oz saying that a Biden victory would be horrible for Australia and that Trump, counterintuitively, is better for Australia. And he listed concerns about climate change and alliance management, et cetera. On the flip side, you had Michael Fullilove, the well-known head of Lowy Institute, arguing in the Sydney Morning Herald that an end of craziness and uncertainty vis-a-vis U.S. positioning on issues that are very important to Australia, multilateralism, et cetera, international institutions, would serve Australia well. So you're now freed from the bonds of public service. I'm wondering, without kind of playing horse race in the debate, if you would just give us your thoughts in terms of the Australia-U.S. relationship and the alliance as it is impacted by the choice that America is making over the course of the next week.
Sure. Well, I think the bilateral relationship in and of itself won't change much, whoever's going to be president. The confidence the U.S. administration under Trump and a new administration under Biden, who has a lot of old Australia hands as his advisors, that will continue. What will change is the global milieu in which we're all operating. So on the one hand, things like the Quad, the step up that Australia is pursuing in the Pacific with full U.S. support and encouragement, the effort to find some way to push back against Chinese aggressiveness in the South China Sea and in the world generally, that will all continue. However, under President Trump, will that continue in this erratic, go-it-alone way with most of the world, trashing multilateral institutions that the US and Australia were so instrumental in setting up as a means of containment, or will it be this ad hoc, scattershot approach that the president has been using more and more? So I think that's where the alliance management, especially from the Australian standpoint, of bringing in the bigger picture will be increasingly difficult, because in the second term, Trump presumably will say, I've been right, the people have endorsed my approach, and he'll keep going the way he has.
You will recall well from your time in Australia that Australians as a whole have long had, this is my simple summary of it, two basic strategies for guaranteeing their own national security, in addition to their own extremely capable but relatively small defense forces. And number one has been reliance on an alliance partner for the last 70 plus years. That's been the United States. And the other side has been reliance upon what has become a mantra in Australian society, the rules-based order. That means multilateralism in all its forms, international institutions, standards, norms, organizations, trade agreements, et cetera. And for the last 4 years, and you kind of alluded to this, it strikes me that in some respects, those two prongs of Australia's national security strategy have been somewhat at odds with each other. With President Trump pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Australia, miraculously kind of resurrecting it and holding the door open, but in a whole range of issues, finding whether it's NATO or whether it's the UN or whether it's the World Trade Organization or whether it's the Paris, climate accords, that international multilateral approach kind of being under attack. And it seems like there's a tension there. Is that something you'd agree with, or is that something I'm mistakenly analyzing there?
Well, I think there is a tension, but I think we've seen middle powers like Australia and Japan and India recognizing that there has to be an independent foreign policy and approach from strictly relying on the US. And so you see much more of, whether it's the successor to TPP, CPTPP, or whether it's increased military cooperation among Japan, Australia, and India, outside of the Quad itself. There is a recognition, actually, that no matter what happens in this election, we are in a slightly more multipolar world. Well, the U.S. may be an important factor in all these coalitions. I don't think people are going to have the confidence to say the U.S. is the leader and will just follow. It's going to be much more everyone pulling on the oar. And I think given the challenges we face, that's a good thing, actually. U.S. can't solve climate change itself. U.S. can't push back against China itself, or Russia, or authoritarianism, which is on the march in all sorts of countries. So this is going to take everyone working together. And sadly, the U.S. brand and credibility has taken a hit. It'll be a long time before it's fully recovered. Let's recognize that and say, okay, we're in this with you. And being with you means letting Australia or Japan or someone else take the lead in some of these things, and we'll follow.
A perfect example of what you're just saying was just 2 weeks ago when they held the Quad foreign ministers meetings in Tokyo, which I thought was a remarkably successful meeting, far more robust than I think we might have anticipated a year ago or so. Although my analysis at the time was that the Quad was taking place in some respects in spite of, not because of, the United States. In other words, it wasn't a product of U.S. outreach. It was a product of Chinese overreach. And so the fact that India and Australia and Japan were very proactive and eager to hug the United States just a month out from an election, it was really more of a product they're concerned about the region, and them taking up the oar, as you rightly described it. But obviously the Quad is something you focus on closely during your tenure as well. It was in a slightly more nascent format then.
Right. I have to say, the change in that aspect of the relationship is remarkable, because 3 years ago, India really, really didn't want to have that sort of relationship. Somehow three was okay, 4 was too many. But now, because of, as you noted, because of China's aggressiveness along their border with India, and I think as time has passed and India's gained confidence that their Look East policy can also include working with this grouping of countries to give it more heft. I think it's a combination of these factors. Look, what has struck me from the beginning of the Trump administration has been the desire of nations in this region to keep the United States involved, act as a balancing factor to the potential hegemon to the north. And the biggest concern is we'll pull out, followed only by the concern that we will force countries to make a choice. Countries don't want to have to make a choice. They want to trade with both. They want to do business with both. But I still think, despite everything, they trust the U.S. not to be telling them where they can drill for oil, or to shut up when their policies don't agree with PRC policies. And they don't know what China will do without some sort of counterweight.
Now, you will recall our institutional focus from the 7 years of our existence has heavily been on Indo-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, Indo-Pacific. You were still in post when Australia released its foreign policy white paper in November 2017, which had as its organizing principle or structure the Indo-Pacific. One of the earlier manifestations of a U.S. approach to the Indo-Pacific was changing the name of the Pacific Command in Hawaii to the Indo-Pacific Command. You've now had over a year there as a senior policy advisor to the Indo-Pacific Command. I wonder if you might, from that perch, and again, you've already started talking about kind of the broader security approach to the region, tell our listeners a little bit of what the Indo-Pacific strategy in the United States is looking like, particularly looking at it from the view of the Indo-Pacific Command there in Hawaii.
Well, let me just start with, for those of your listeners who haven't dealt with military folks before, these are highly educated, highly skilled, appreciative of nuanced individuals. So the Captain Strangelove cartoon is just not accurate. That said, they are also warriors, and therefore they have to prepare for all the contingencies. And they realize that the most important military among the democracies of the world is the U.S. and they have 375,000 people working in IndoPACOM all around the region to make sure the current regime continues. That is the free and open Indo-Pacific as defined by sea lanes and air travel, and not using might makes right. That said, they also recognize that alliances are vital. They do not want to fight by themselves. They spend a lot of time making sure the alliances in the region stay healthy, that they're engaged. The commander, until COVID, spent a lot of time traveling throughout the region and cementing those relationships and listening carefully. I'd also remind your listeners that the interoperability and the communication between the Australian military and IndoPACOM is incredible. I would wander around the building and I would hear Aussie accents all the time. The deputy commander of the U.S. Army Pacific is always an Australian. In our intelligence system, there's an Australian deputy. It's remarkable. And of course, your consul general in Hawaii is a liaison to the diplomatic function of IndoPACOM. So it is almost like a little mini government in Hawaii, insofar as the commander looks at the broad range of the relationships throughout the region to keep the U.S. engaged, especially, of course, from the military side. But we work, and the reason I was there as a State Department employee was to make sure we're synced up as possible with the State Department, making sure our foreign policy and the military aspect of that are as coordinated as possible. So yeah, the U.S., despite it all, is still making a huge investment in the region, certainly from the military sense. And it's really impressive. If you go out to Pearl Harbor and see all the facilities, it's pretty amazing.
We only half jokingly referred to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade representative here in Perth as the ambassador to Western Australia. And functionally, the Australian Consul General in Hawaii functions as ambassador to IndoPACOM. And it sounds to me like your last posting there was functionally as well, as an ambassador from Washington, D.C. to IndoPACOM. Fascinating point of the world, it really is. Well, now you're in Singapore. At the outset, you noted that you arrived just in time to see the shutdown. The BowerGroupAsia is well known in the region, particularly for its long and deep strength in Southeast Asia. I wondered if you might tell us a little bit about your work with the BowerGroupAsia, and then based on that, kind of the state of play. You've already described your ability to move within Singapore, but obviously COVID and the resulting economic disruption has probably changed your daily workload from what you thought it would be when you originally made the decision to move to Singapore.
Well, you know, when as you mentioned, I was a banker before joining the State Department, and so I was taught to look at the numbers and analyze them and come up with a prediction of the future. And years ago, when I joined State, I looked at the numbers, and it was very clear from a demographic and economic growth trajectory, despite the '98 financial crisis in Southeast Asia, this is the region that's going to be in a trajectory going up. And despite all the ups and downs it has been, it's a young population, very dynamic, with a lot of pent-up demand for all sorts of goods, and a lot of labor that's available as China becomes more and more expensive to take up the slack and become sort of the manufacturing center for a lot of goods and services around the world. So when I decided to leave State, I wanted to come back to this region because it's so exciting. And Singapore, of course, is the entrepot, the center where a lot of business happens, where a lot of information is exchanged. BowerGroupAsia has been doing business in the region, 24 offices throughout the region for 15 years. We have local people everywhere, and they're tied in. So being at the nexus of all that, I find almost a little bit like State Department, getting all this intel for what's going on, whether it's in Thailand right now, or Malaysia, or Indonesia, or wherever. You know, Gordon, you know, I've always admired your efforts to get Western Australia and Australia in general to look more to Southeast Asia as not just a problem to be managed, but an opportunity to be attained. And yeah, it's hard. It's, you know, 10 different countries in ASEAN with different rules and always complex social and political conditions. But, you know, when I was a banker, I also was taught, if you have a client who has one customer, that's really dangerous. What happens if that customer leaves? You have to have diversification. And while diversification is really tough, especially when you have such a great client as China, you've got to take some of those profits and invest in your next client, your next customer, because otherwise you're depending on one, and that's never a good place to be. So one of the things BowerGroupAsia does is help our clients enter markets, learn about markets, navigate the difficult regulatory and political and societal issues. And we're still staying really busy with all of that because COVID, of course, has thrown a lot of balls up into the air. So we're busy helping try and catch them and explain them.
Your banker's description of the mandate for diversification just overlays perfectly with our institutional level on a diplomatic, security, broader economic level, investment, et cetera. So you won't be surprised to know that our mantra has been diversify, diversify, diversify for the last 7 years. And yet it is a challenge. We're hosting actually the week of the 16th of November for the 3rd year in a row, Western Australia ASEAN Trade and Investment Dialogue. This year, that'll be an entire week of online events, again, trying to inspire people in our community here to kind of look north, but also to let our colleagues in the region understand kind of the growing and dynamic, albeit small community that we've got here. So we're gonna have to tune into you and your many colleagues in the region to kind of make that happen. I wondered if I could turn just a little bit to trade, and then I'll finish up with kind of a more broad question. You were involved in the negotiating of U.S. free trade agreements with Australia and with Thailand. And then during your tenure, you saw the United States pull out of what had been kind of the preeminent regional free trade agreement in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. If all goes as planned, by the end of next month, Australia, with most countries in the region, are going to sign on to a regional cooperative economic partnership, RCEP for trade agreement, without the United States, and in this case, unfortunately, without India. I'm wondering if you might just kind of put your past trade negotiator hat on and look forward and talk about what you see to be the future for free trade agreements, institutions. Again, we don't know the outcomes of the United States election, but one hopes that at some point the United States will return to its role as a leader of that process as opposed to a detractor.
Well, let's start with why TPP was going to be difficult to pass and why Hillary Clinton actually turned against it at the end of her campaign for president. And it's because there's a fundamental problem that free trade agreements tear away the protections that protect certain industries. And what happens to the people who've invested in those industries based on the conditions that prevailed then, and the workers who worked in those industries? You know, not everyone in the U.S. who worked in steel could suddenly go and work on IT. There was supposed to be something called trade adjustment assistance that would help these workers find new jobs and get retrained, but it was never properly funded. It was never properly thought through. And if I'm a steel worker in Pittsburgh and suddenly I'm unemployed because the steel is coming from POSCO in Korea, I'm just not going to be a happy guy and think this trade agreement does nothing for me. I don't care if I'm spending a couple bucks less for consumer goods. So we didn't do a good job, I say we who dealt with international trade, of explaining and making sure that free trade helped those who would be most directly affected by the opening up of our economies. That's A. B, you know, the press will report on everyone who cheats on a trade agreement, and the overall positive impacts are rarely discussed. So, you know, some company is underpaying labor in a country. Suddenly it calls into question these higher FTA. So we have a problem with image. Now, Australia's done a brilliant job of saying we are a trading nation, that's how we live. And also, as we've seen from your auto sector, you have a whole sector wiped out because of free trade. But somehow your unemployment rate stayed low because you found other jobs for those people. How'd you do that? How can we do the same sort of thing? And my point going forward is, under Trump, I don't think anything will change. I think even under Biden, it may take some time to demonstrate that environmental standards are going to be enforced and upped if U.S. joined the CPTPP. That labor standards would be enforced and increased. That it would be good for your average worker. The other thing to note really quickly is COVID has increased protectionism as countries realized suddenly that supply chains were more, well, not as resilient as they could have been for critical pharmaceuticals, personal protective gear. Now with concerns about supply chains with critical goods, whether it's minerals, where we signed an agreement with Australia to produce critical minerals in Australia and the US and bypass China, or tech. How's that going to work? Are we going to have free trade agreements or some sort of trusted supplier agreements between countries as a way to do this? Or are we going to have required onshoring, which has been discussed even in Australia for some pharmaceutical goods? So it really is calling into question what happens next, because resilience is now going to be prized, at least for a little while, over just in time. They're saying instead of just in time, just in case. How that's going to fall out. And finally, on RCEP, it's a good thing. It's not particularly ambitious as far as add-ons to existing trade agreements. The big kahuna was India joining up, and India not joining up makes it all a little less, actually a lot less, to me, important.
It may be a bit quixotic on my part, but in the 2 or 3 opportunities I've had in recent weeks to speak with Biden officials, I've gotten a very similar message from you in terms of the difficulty of selling TPP, the prioritization around COVID, et cetera, et cetera. And the notion is really it's going to be a while before the U.S. returns any type of leadership. And I actually, perhaps self-servingly, but looking at it from a regional perspective, think that as the region turns to COVID recovery, how do we emerge? If the United States wants to have any type of leadership role in this region, they've got to return back to things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And on the plus side, if there's one very positive thing I can say about the last 4 years of Donald Trump, is that he, in many respects, has made it safe for Democrats to support free trade. In other words, he's been so over the top in his nativism and his antagonism towards kind of both allies and foreign institutions writ large, that what you do is you have a large portion of the American public which now has a very different view of free trade than they did before, partly just because it's the opposite of what Trump had viewed. So Chicago Council on Global Affairs for the last 4 years has been measuring U.S. support for free trade, including questions like, does it benefit me personally? Does it benefit my community? And they're at record highs. And so my feeling is that there's more of an opportunity than people stuck in 2016 might recognize. And if the U.S. is going to take a leadership role in the region in COVID recovery, they're going to have to do more than talk. Otherwise, we're going to fall further behind, and the U.S. will fall further behind. So anyway, a bit of editorializing there.
I agree.
Let me wrap up. We've already taken a good chunk of your time today, but COVID dominates so much of our discussion. It's going to take some time before we begin to reconnect the region in terms of travel and tourism and stuff like that. But I think it's essential. And one of the things that we've tried to do as an institution for the last 10 months is to focus on the stories underneath COVID, things that are happening that are really important, but that we're not paying attention to because the U.S. election just kind of squeezes it out, and COVID stories kind of squeeze it out. You've already mentioned, developments in Thailand. There are continuing issues in Malaysia. South China Seas is a perennial issue. I'm kind of curious if there's 2 or 3 issues in 2021. Now I realize that after 2020, anybody who had any hope of looking at the next year has probably thrown up their hands in futility. But I'm looking at 2021. What are the 2 or 3 trends, issues, developments that you're watching with either concern or the opportunity that we ought to be paying attention to?
All right, let's assume there's a Biden victory. This is a huge opportunity to reform multilateral institutions because they will see that without the U.S., these institutions can't work well. we're just too big, the US, too important to global trade, to global politics. And they've seen that there are people in the US of importance who say, let's just pull out. But hopefully under a Biden administration say, look, we want to strengthen this institution to make it that it can withstand this sort of criticism in the US, but we have to make these more efficient. We have to make these fit for purpose in this century. So the WTO doesn't take 2, 3, 4 years to arrive at a conclusion on an anti-dumping case. So hopefully that will be one opportunity. ASEAN similarly had an opportunity under COVID to come together to say, how do we all work together as a group of nations to battle this disease? I would say, I would give them a C-. They talked about it, but as usual, they're unable to push things forward. I'd like to see them working more closely together to say, all right, there's an opportunity as manufacturers leave China because they need to diversify their supply chain, to find some way to work together on attracting that sort of investment. But what we're seeing is they are competing with each other, which for American companies, that's a good thing as they compete. I'm not sure it's the best thing for ASEAN as a whole to have continuing differencing approaches to this sort of opportunity. And finally, on sort of the political level, Malaysia, Thailand, some of the demonstrations we're seeing in Indonesia as a result of their passage of their omnibus bill, there is political ferment, demand for some sort of change in how people are governed or effectiveness of government. So will this be one of these things that fizzles out, or will it grow? And I think, to me, for this region, that's going to be a big question going forward. When I was based in Thailand, if I had been told there'd be demonstrations denouncing the monarchy, I would never have believed you. That Malaysia could be in yet another political crisis, so soon after the last political crisis. And how it comes out from here, don't know. And finally, that Jokowi, who is so popular, has basically not been able to manage some fundamental economic reform very well.
Well, 2020 is far from over. The week between now and the election in the United States seems interminably long, and given what we've experienced this year, it seems like we're bound for quite a few more surprises before then, let alone before the end of the year. But I can say one thing for sure, is that we're glad to have you back in the region, helping us make sense of it. We look forward to working with you throughout the rest of 2020 and into 2021. And again, to crossing paths in Singapore once the flights reopen, but again, to getting you returned to join us and our community here in Western Australia as well. So Jim, thank you so much for your time and sharing your insights today. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Gordon. Great talking to you.